Right? If you didn't have ovens that could burn the corpses fast enough, you couldn't kill them. So now from the and there are the ovens. Okay. All right. So from the perspective of the traditional view of a neutral technology, the engineers who designed these ovens could focus solely on the design problems, right? So the engineers from Top and Sons came back multiple times to Birkenau to correct problems. Another good thing in the movie, Hess asks the engineers, "How was the trip this time?" Right? Because they had come many times to Birkenau, right? There were lots of engineering problems that the engineers had to come back to solve. Ventilation problems, cracked furnaces, all kinds of things, right? But they kept on coming back because they were good engineers. They had to fix their artifact to make sure that it worked right, right? Okay, now, can this blind devotion to the technical task be defended as a moral position? Well, in his memoirs, Spears did attempt a defense. First, he argued that he was isolated because he was in a authoritarian regime. Okay, right, and he didn't really know what was going on. Right, but second, he said, "But I shouldn't have been isolated. I should have known. But what happened was I was solely devoted to my technical task." Right, and I shouldn't have been that either. Now, of course, you can't really believe what he wrote in his memoirs because he was in prison then. He was hoping to be rehabilitated when he came out, right? But so he tried to say, well, yeah, I should have known that I was guilty, right? Because I shouldn't have followed the technological neutrality model, right? Now, this position, right, that Speer says in his memoirs, I should have not done the technical stuff. I should have looked at this more morally. This is what legal scholar Jack Sammons calls an example of rebellious ethics. Now, rebellious ethics is the claim, right, that to be moral, one has to rebel against the expectations of your profession, that you have to sort of separate yourself and realize that you're a person, you're a human being, you're not just a technician. So you rebel against the technical aspect of your life, and you reassert your humanity, right? So the way Salmon summarizes this, we must consciously maintain a personal and psychological detachment from our professional roles. Now, Salmons and I believe that the position of rebellious ethics is wrong, completely wrong, right? Speer did not fail because he was too much of an architect. He failed in his professional role as an architect. We have to have a deeper integration of values and technology. And once you have a deeper integration of values and technology, you see that every technological profession has moral value as its basis. The moral value of architecture is to build environments that lead to human flourishing. The moral value of engineering is to build efficient artifacts to further human life. The moral value of medicine is to promote health. Any profession, right, has a moral value at its basis. So you don't want to rebel from your profession to be moral. You want to embrace the moral value of your profession, right? And this is what Speer failed to do, right? So Speer is not a pure technician who failed as a moral agent because he did not rebel against his technological field. He's a failed architect because he did not embrace, right, the values of his profession, instead sold out his profession for power, money, and all sorts of corruption. All right, how am I doing on time? I got 5? Okay, I should be able to do it. All right, so we have technological practice and ethics integrated, but what if the unified integration is itself evil, right? And here we come back to the Nazi engineers. Now, Michael Tad Allen is an historian who examined the lives of the elite SS engineering corps. right? He went through the personal histories of 39 of the 60 or so engineers in this corps. And what he found was that they all had the same basic ideological principles or values, right? And these values led them to do what they did, right? Now, what does this mean, right? I'm not going to go through the actual values. You can see them on this slide, by the way. That's a picture of Hess there on the right. Mengele is in the middle, and Richard Baer is the closest one to us on the left. He took over from Hess at Auschwitz, right? So, what Allen's analysis shows, he says, they had an overarching set of values that informed all their decisions and actions. These technological professionals believed in what they were doing, right? In Allen's wonderful description, they were the model citizens of a murderous regime, right? Their personal worldview and the Nazi worldview were identical, right? They did not have to rebel against anything because they were doing what they believed was the right thing to do. Now, we've reached a very dark place, right? Right. First, we thought that technological artifacts might be neutral, in which case the engineer could just say, hey, I only designed the furnace, right? But that's not good, right? Then we say, no, you have to embrace the values of your profession. But what if the values of your profession are the values of a murderous regime, right? So that's the lesson we learned from Allen's analysis of the SS engineers. So this technology, the technology of the Nazis serves an illustration of a thesis, again, of Langdon Winter, that all artifacts, all technological creations embody political and social values. Technological artifacts actualize particular moral realities, right? We look at this from a practical point of view. If most of my argument about ontology and all this kind of stuff gets you confused, think of purpose. No technological object is designed without a purpose, right? But a purpose implies a value. And so this is the crux of the problem with the Nazi engineers, right? The crematorium ovens at Birkenau and Auschwitz were designed with a purpose. The purpose was to facilitate genocide. There's no other way to look at the ovens, right, that were designed to burn 8 people at a time, right, and have their ashes commingle, right? The increased capacity of the internal oven chambers and design obviated the need for maintaining the integrity of the remains, was a clear indication that the ovens would be part of a technological system of mass murder. The purpose of the ovens, as I said, was to facilitate genocide, right? In Pressack and Van Pelt's history of this period, they come to the conclusion that the engineers of the SS building division slowly realized that the entire final solution rested on the capacity of the ovens, right, on this technological project, right? Again, to the Nazi engineers, this was good, right? The ovens would solve a crucial technical problem, which would solve a crucial social problem, the necessary improvement in human life, Aryan life, by eliminating inferior species, right? So that's the very dark place. What does this mean for us and our students? What did it mean for me when I was teaching engineers, all right? We must acknowledge, right, that all technological artifacts have values embedded within them, that whatever engineers create will embody a particular set of political, ethical, social, and cultural values and ideologies. If instead we hold on to the idea that the design and creation of technology is ethically neutral, then we will be repeating the mistakes of the Nazi engineers and Albert Speer. To avoid the technological ethics of genocide, we must always consider the moral purposes of our technological projects. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I went over. So 2 articles of mine that will give you a fuller discussion of this topic, if you're so interested. Thanks. All right.
Thank you so much. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's from a family of genocide survivors, it's always very emotional and heart-wrenching to see these things. So as I was seeing it, my BP was getting high. It's very personal. So thank you so much for looking into it. It's never easy. It's never easy. So did we learn from this? All the atrocities that had happened there, the thing that our colleague just mentioned? I think we did. Unfortunately, I think we did learn for the wrong reasons. We have been very efficient in killing people, both offline, but also online. So today, what I'm going to talk about, I will try to cover some of the things. As you can visibly see, I became very emotional seeing this. It's never easy to talk about these things, but how you dehumanize people, how you other people to justify mass killings and genocides. We are going to, but I will request you to imagine a place where the population has been othered, stripped of their citizenship for decades, being in an open air prison for decades, needed permission even to paint their walls, repair their walls, to get married, to have children. And then they were oppressed so much that they did not even have official set of alphabets to write, to express themselves. And in that background, I'm just not going to talk about the oppressions that had happened to them in their own homeland, but as they escape genocides, how that perpetuates, how the discriminations have been there, even they were, the physical death, they kind of escaped. So let's talk about that. So we are talking about the Rohingyas from Myanmar or Burma, one of the most persecuted populations in the world. Unfortunately, they are not attractive enough to cover world media attention anymore. There are so many media cycles and our attention span has focused on something else. This is one of the paths, the routes the Rohingyas took. It was taken in 2017 August when they were escaping a planned ethnic cleansing by the Burmese army and the militias from the southwestern border of Myanmar. Interestingly, this was not the first time people used that route to escape. During the partition of British India, there were huge communal riots, and a lot of South Asians escaped through this route from Yangon or Rangoon to the modern day India and Bangladesh. So people have been persecuted systematically in that region. Another picture of this, as I was talking to my colleague here, the way the British did administration during that time, it's always easy to blame the British and move on, but we're going to do beyond that. So this is Naf River. So one side of this became part of British India, then East Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. And the other part was part of Arakan or Rakhine, part of modern day Myanmar. The villages were burning. It's their villages. They were escaping and then coming towards Bangladesh. Before the partition and even before the British rule, they used to be part of a same kingdom at some point, which was the Kingdom of Arakan. And now we see a bustling city of 1.3 million people, the largest refugee camp in the world, where majority are women, then we have children. And if you see the border here, this is the river I'm talking about. This is Myanmar, and these are the camps where majority of the Rohingyas are now living. So there are so many challenges, but one of the things I wanted to talk about is the so-called neutrality of technology. Now, as engineers, as telecom engineer, we talk about the value of network, right? More people is better. More traffic is good for business. So imagine our social media platforms. More traffic, more likes, more shares, better for business. Our social media platforms tremendously, shamelessly failed us during this genocide, where the biggest platforms had no idea how to counter the groups, the numerous groups, the countless groups that had been popped up to kill people, to orchestrate genocides, to make sure that they can attack villages from multiple sides. There were hashtags of color, which is the N-word equivalent here. Then Bengali, which is the ethnicity of people from Bengal or modern day West Bengal and Bangladesh, but Bengali in a very racially degraded way. Those hashtags were used openly. People were reporting that to the social media platforms. They had no idea. In fact, there are documents where people who reported got banned because they were the one inciting violence. So what we see, our so-called neutrality or net neutrality, in many cases failed us miserably as the people were getting killed. Now, during that time also, when Rohingyas, majority of the Rohingyas were in Myanmar, they were not allowed to use any smartphones. They were harassed, they were jailed, huge fines were put if people could find smartphones with them. Even with the normal non-smart feature phones, that was not encouraged to be used if you wanted to be really, really safe. So that was the thing that happened during that time. Now, majority of the Rohingyas crossed the border. Now, we are talking about the biggest refugee camp in the world, but here also, they had huge issues. They're still having issues. First of all, in order to have access to legal SIM cards in Bangladesh, you need to have biometric IDs. Now imagine, we're talking about one of the most heavily persecuted population. They were very uncomfortable with putting their data online for somebody else. And this is where the UN also failed miserably. Because if you go for the data policy, usage policy of any of the leading organizations of humanitarian agency, those are black box. You need aid, you give your data. So my right to my data, my right over my agency over that definitely get compromised based on where I am. Am I a citizen, non-citizen? Where am I? Depending on that. So together, there was a huge hodgepodge in terms of, can they get legal phone SIM cards? They could not. And that has not been solved until now. The mobile service there at best can be very, very patchy. The data service is not there. So what we are looking into is huge discrimination in terms of quality of service, access to network, and availability of network. So by law, is it illegal for the refugees to have phones there? Yes. By practice, are they having it? Everybody has SIM cards. But the problem is they're paying higher prices, the quality is bad, and they get regularly harassed by the law enforcement agencies for accessing internet. What we are also seeing is what has been compromised is access to information as a human right for the displaced community context. We have not seen that in in the Rohingya camps, and we have not seen that in many parts of the world where we are seeing displaced population. We're also seeing within the marginalized community the exclusion, especially of women, from accessing information. We have observed a lot of fake news, especially that got worse when COVID happened. It was so disconcerting and disconnecting. It was such dark humor. Imagine this, that WHO is putting in one of the most densely populated camp, you need to maintain social distance. You need to wash your hands where there was no running water. And then those messages were translated in English and Burmese. So the joke was the languages of their oppressors, the last two oppressors. That was the communication they could get. Imagine, they do not have alphabets, official alphabets. Then how you communicate those things with the Rohingyas? So that was a huge, huge mess. But while doing this, what we have seen is fascinating workarounds, innovations, and imaginations while they were combating injustice and persecution. Those are some of the images in different parts of the time I was there. First of all, what we have observed is even though they acknowledge their persecution through internet, through social media, they imagined and wanted to appropriate social network as a sense of hope. I'll skip first this one, the last slide, then I'll come back. I had a workshop, couple of workshops with them in the middle of, like, imagine, in the middle of nowhere, there's no internet. I had workshop with the women and the Rohingya young guys and others and told them, imagine internet. What is for you? What is internet for you? What is the future that it holds? Now for them, what they're saying is, there are two things. One is, for them, internet is lack of network. So they would imagine in the future, they would have an antenna that could cover all of them so that they can be included in the conversation. Then the other one, when I was asking one of the elderly women, what is a good inclusive internet to you? She was saying, an inclusive internet to me is my ability to sit in my home, refugee talking about home, sit in my home and be able to track down the people who are harassing my daughter over phone. We're talking about cyberbullying. We're talking about harassment using phone. A lot of women trafficking happening using phones and whatnot. But their imagination of using technology, their hope of using technology, even though they have been heavily persecuted. The other thing what we saw there is the leadership. We have seen them heavily using internet for coming up with their own news networks because they need to have their own voices. Many of those stages where VFX related and green things were there because they were in the camp, and those were all illegal. All the internet related broadcasting they were doing from the camps were definitely illegal. So whenever I had to make contacts with them, I had to go dark from my own handler so that I can have a good conversation with the people who were creating media. The other part, what we have seen is they came up with their own alternative network of information. First of all, on the top, on the bottom right, what you see is a charging station, and they had their own manual two-stage authentication to make sure that whose cell phone is what. So because the charge electricity, there was no grid whatsoever. So there are car batteries. If you see on the top right, you can see the car batteries getting connected with the laptops. Now, all the laptops that they have were actually nodes of internet because every laptop was equipped with a lot of content. The content included extremist videos, Al-Qaeda recruiting services. They had adult entertainment. They had dubbed Hollywood bootleg versions of, latest movies. Everything and anything was there. And the content was changed based on the customer demand. If people wanted more movies, there will be more movies in the next cycle. There was a whole, our research showed a whole ecosystem of content creation and delivery based on the demand side of it. So there was a whole supply chain involving to it. Am I done? 5 minutes. Oh, I can talk. The other thing, what we saw is based on the struggles of access to information, there comes a lot of entrepreneurial activities. And information was the key in terms of being exchanged. It's a key product. Information became a key product. So it became a huge deal, especially when COVID hit, for customized content of health communication. But even with that discrimination, what we have seen, the women were heavily marginalized. So that's one of my favorite photographs I use all the time. So one of the NGOs, of course, we want to empower women. So, okay, let them start making clothes. We have the sewing machines and whatnot. You see on the background of it, right? And then you see she's totally disinterested about whatever. But then the other ones, they forced the instructor, you know what? We don't want to know how to make clothes. We want to know how to repair mobile phones. Because the guys don't want us to be in the shops. The guys don't want us to access internet. We want to, first of all, repair our own thing. Second of all, we want to make money by repairing things. And third kind, what happened later, we saw an underground network of women influencers using internet and using communication technology to communicate their own thing. So there's a whole underground network which has connections with other Rohingya women, solidarity network outside Myanmar and Bangladesh. And during COVID time as well, they had their own way of communicating stuff. So I am not burdening you with some big research questions because there are so many that we have been working on in terms of the issue of justice of design, the issue of equity when it comes to who access what and how alternative internet can counter the traditional internet and whatnot, and the way it's getting more effective than the traditional telecommunication way of doing things. But what gives me hope is the way people turned around, the resilience of these people in the face of brutality and oppression, that which did not end after they crossed their border to survive. And it's still going on in the digital space. So their fight is also going on. So that's one of the pictures that I have where we see two young Rohingya girls going towards a better future and, you know, leaving their atrocity and past. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay. Uh, can you hear me? I can hear myself, but okay. All right. Thank you. Welcome. First time. Apologies are set aside. Welcome. And to a presentation on the history of media technology and propaganda and its role in Rwandan history. I just want to say that it's a very complicated period of history that I study. And we're just going to focus on the salient details about the project. And my hope is that people understand that what happened in 1994 took almost a century, really, to unfurl. So my project inspiration, because as some of us do wonder what inspires you to really want to consecrate your life to the study of genocide. In my case, it's a peculiar fascination with the human condition that was ignited by reading Anne Frank's diary. I think I was about 11 because my mother happened to take the television away from me, too much MTV at the time, and I had nothing to do but go to the library. And so I just decided to answer or try and answer the questions, which I could not believe people that looked just like us had did something that they were saying not that long ago. And so, so began for roughly 2 years until I got to high school, a period of just reading in the library, which technically really was a mile away. I did look this up in Google a few decades later. So in order to do this project, I have so far traveled to Belgium, Leuven, and I also traveled to Rome to do archival research in the archives. We're going to get into which archives. In May, I will be traveling to Rwanda a second time. The first time was more just to meet the country, meet the people. I was at a conference in Tanzania. It is next door. So I did go and I met a lot of people. I did a ton of shopping, I might add. And what a beautiful place, what a beautiful country. Project background. So in the spring of 1994, over 800,000 ordinary people were slaughtered in Rwanda over the span of roughly 100 days. Approximately 175 to 210,000 ordinary farmers, school teachers, bureaucrats, just basically everyday people became those murderers. And the other salient detail is that the media and radio broadcasts were blamed for inciting the violence. And so just to give you or paint some perspective, it would really be as though whenever you, I don't know what your music tastes are, but if it's Kiss FM or KJZZ or in everything in between, imagine if that was just blaring, you know, go kill the Democrats. Just go kill them, go kill them, go kill them now. There's some living next to you, you need to kill them. You need to take care of this. This is the good work you need to do. So imagine that's just the environment that pervades the society. So my research questions, because I was fascinated about the genocide. I do remember this in college happening, and I just always remember thinking why, what drove this to occur. So in the span of since becoming a PhD student and candidate, eventually I formulated some research questions with the help of my committee, Volker being one of them. Thank you. And so these are some of the questions that I decided to point myself in the direction. So how did media technology and propaganda actually enter Rwandan society? How did Rwandans come to appropriate these instruments? What did Rwandans do with these instruments? And what is the historic legacy of their appropriation? Just a note about some of these pictures, but to your furthest right, you see President Johnson on the far right, and then next to him is the then president of Rwanda, Gregoire Kayibanda. So in between is just a bulletin that Kayibanda's Office of Media put out in order to, you know, just make a media event. It is a huge event, I think, meeting the president of any country, but certainly the US. And then just on the side, it's just my finger, so that IP and that this is me. I'm not publishing these pictures except here. So, research project, a little bit about the description. So the project goal is really an examination of the primary sources authored by the carriers of technology. I'll say this again, the carriers of technology and those who appropriated the technology. I really want to understand how media, technology, and propaganda both enter the society, and again, really understand, not just from a Eurocentric perspective, but really understand what Rwandans did with it. So there is a historiographical gap. That's a long word, but it really just means that what have other people written on the topic? So in attempting to see where my research fits and what I can possibly contribute, I believe that it's really necessary to understand how Rwandans acquired the propaganda techniques that they then used in order to create their propaganda. And I, in my research, did not see enough devoted to the pursuit of this specific focus, this specific topic. So what I hope this research contributes is that it's a case study on the history of media technology and propaganda in Africa from 1900 to 1964, and that it connects the importance of human carriers to technology or technological diffusion and colonialism, and the role of elites in appropriation. So those are just the three. Just a slide to just show you who I've taken my history from, who I've learned a lot over the last 7+ years. The third from the left is my other advisor on the committee, Dr. Andrew Barnes. He studies missionary history in Africa, and also just the work to develop technology in the culture, and what the just across the board colonizers did to throw impediments to education. But on the far right is a particular favorite of mine, Jacques Ellul and propaganda. And I'm just a big fan of his. Next over is a dissertation by Jean-François Munyakayanza. I think his work actually on this topic is really is just amazing. And then of course, my external advisor is actually Dr. J.J. Carney, and he wrote Rwanda Before the Genocide. My methodology is I think fun. I don't know if a lot of people say that, but I will. It's fun, I think, because it's interdisciplinary, and it borrows from a lot of places I think have a lot to say. So, or excuse me, groups, intellectual groups and traditions. History of technology, we heard Dr. Katz mention Langdon Winner. He actually fits into this niche. Communication and propaganda studies, colonialism and decolonization. If you're going to study Africa, this is invariably an intersection you meet. And of course, genocide studies, of which we have people in this room, of course, that have provided also mentoring by way of a borrowed copy, but that's okay. Still a grad student, so grad student wages. How did media technology enter Rwanda society? We'll just sort of gaze for a moment, take it in. Why does she use this slide? Well, it's because it came via human carriers. So literature review of Rwandan history does teach one that the introduction of media technology came by way of missionaries. Certainly has the colonizers, military in Europe was set afoot to take the entire continent. Missionaries also arrived. Instead, they wanted to mine for souls. And so they were the ones that brought printing presses with them in order to print their own catechisms and their own learning material. So in addition to the work that they did to build missions, they also built schools. So they're essentially responsible for building, we're focused on Rwanda, but the school system in Rwanda. There were other missionary organizations. Yes, there were Protestant organizations. This happens to be a Catholic organization by the name of the White Fathers, so named by their very vivid white clothing. So to evangelize, they recognized, and as missionaries did, that they needed the instruments of technology in order to do this in remote places. So as carriers of media technology, they intentionally and unintentionally transfer ways of using technology. They do this through culture and technique. They provide the means to participate in technology through exposure to hardware. So as carriers, they produce an environment that allows these transfers to occur. And then they enable the leverage of social networks to facilitate internal and external communication. So within the society itself, within the members of different social groups, and certainly because we're now talking colonialism, anything beyond. The legacy of the White Fathers, it's a double slide, and really the question, how did Rwandans come to appropriate these instruments? So I just somewhat briefly described that, yes, missionaries came with media technology. Imagine as the century passed, right, different media came of age. Eventually wireless technology in the form of telegraph, and we're talking radio at some point. So how did Rwandans come to possess these technologies for themselves? Well, first place was, of course, schools. So the schools that missionaries built were sites of technological transfers. So in the course of studying, you are going to learn how to read, you're going to learn how to write, and this is your first introduction to media technology. The White Fathers also had on-the-job training. At some point, actually, in their career on the continent, this is not about a missionary history or the history of the White Fathers per se, but this group actually did produce cinemas. They produced movies that were pretty well viewed, and had a full-on cinema studio at that point in time the Congo. So these schools, these seminaries that the missionaries set up, they also, Rwandan students that attended these schools, the really good ones, right, graduate, you're offered an opportunity to attend advanced education. And many of them actually traveled during the post-war period, traveled to Europe and received advanced degrees. Many also, or maybe not many, but the instrumental ones to our story were also sponsored to receive journalism degrees. And so what we learn as we do this literature review is we come to understand that you have the people who brought the technology with them, and they had ways of communicating, and they also had a belief system in using the technology. And so when you begin to go through the archives, you find innumerable traces of the use of technology. So how do I differentiate what I'm trying to do? I'm really trying to show a dotted line from 1994 into the past, so that we all come to understand that it is a very real matter to just plop technology in, and the rest of the social impact is not actually on the table as well. So what did Rwandans do with these instruments? As I alluded to, they did journalism, media production, and propaganda. These are all examples I found in the archives of primary source material that Rwandans produced. But the production in and of itself is quite fascinating, because it's not as though they actually owned their own print shops. They did not. And so the question might come up, well, gee, how did they manage to get their messages in terms of content development? How did their content enter rather premier newspapers? Le Courrier d'Afrique, that had a a sort of East African distribution network. And so by definition, these are international papers. Kinyamateka to the far right, I'm using this particular picture as an example, but that actually was an issue that was very excited that Hitler had been beaten. So if you're going to look in the rest of that particular issue, it's really pretty crisp black and white pictures of all of generals and the heads of state, basically celebrating the fact that Hitler lost. Remember, Rwanda was a Belgian colony. These examples are really important in order to continue to do research. They're the artifacts that Rwandans wrote themselves. When you're doing this particular history, there's really not a lot to go with. So it feels like you're doing medieval history or something even older. So sometimes, right? Because it's how do you interpret how people thought, or if they didn't actually write their thoughts down? So this case study ends up being, in many regards, not just an attempt to write history, but it's also an attempt to do analysis and certainly make it relevant to today, but draw these parallels. I hope I wasn't rambling. Okay. So media's decolonization role. Why did they want to appropriate media technology? Because like all repressed people, oppressed people, they just simply need their voices heard. They need to band together. And, you know, when you're collective, you have a chance at getting what you want. So media's decolonization role was huge in Rwanda. You had your different groups. Now I can introduce what maybe is somewhat familiar to people, Hutu and Tutsi, but during the post-World War era has really Africa and the world in general is trying to come back from war. Economies are getting investments from places like the US or Soviet Union. And so for the 50s and early 60s, if you look at the pictures anyway, it does kind of look inviting. Things were on the move, things were on the go, things were changing. So in Africa, what was changing is we want rights, we want freedom. And so media was used specifically by both ethnic groups, by the leadership and the elites in both ethnic groups to get their message out, their particular version of how they wanted to see independence happen. And so between one manifesto, the Bahutu Manifesto or the Mise en Point, both of these documents represent a culmination of really an intellectual work that had been happening really since the White Fathers arrived. 5 minutes. Perfect timing. So conclusions. Although my research has not concluded, there are signs that point to things that I can admit right now. And that is, so colonialism definitely rearranged the social and political networks. It also introduced a Western alphabet, writing, and of course, media technology and propaganda techniques. Decolonization provided an impetus to use these tools, these Western communication techniques and technology to develop a new mass media and for recruiting. And actually, it's electioneering. It's to get people to the polls, frankly. Carriers of media technology are consequential. I think that's an important thing. Like the people who actually use the technology are important because they transfer communication techniques and models that shape the end use, with or without their knowledge. The legacy of Rwandan appropriation of media technology is for the Rwandan people to decide. But in the meantime, I feel what's important is understanding that the history of the social impact of media technology transfers and how these shape courses of action is really what we could be improving on an individual basis. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you. First, let me say thank you to our panelists for three excellent presentations, each different yet connected thematically. And so we have a few minutes left, and let me turn it over to any questions from the audience. Questions?
So, Professor Katz, the U.S. military industrial complex and the consequences of creating armament that is then distributed around the world to encourage mass killing. What's the justification for people like us that are having jobs with those companies that are producing that armament that eventually ends up in the hands of people that have lower moral standards that allow them to kill people?
Yeah. I mean, it's a question. I mean, obviously, it's a large question, right? Question of weapons design and production, right? Until we live in a world where there's no war and everybody's together, right? Peaceful harmony. Weapons have to be created, right? This is not a topic that I've actually gone into deeply, right? But yeah, clearly, what we have to be thinking about is how weapons can be used, right? When an engineer designs a weapon, he has to be thinking about how it can be used, not only in the context of what he's designing it for, right, but in the context of how it could be used in other ways, right? It's no different than the design of a gun, right? Right. To me, even a better example, I used to end my classes on this with my students about something that they all think that they're doing, what are engineering projects that you think that you're doing that are good? In that sense, you would be like the Nazi engineers. You think you're doing something good, right? And I gave them this hypothetical example. What are people going to think 100 years from now when they look back at us and see how all of us just destroyed the natural environment, right? They're going to say, what were these people thinking? How could they design these things to do this, right? Well, we all think that we're doing good, we're doing okay, we're doing good things, right? That's the problem. How do you know when you're doing something good, right? I once said to my dissertation advisor, the criteria for determining what action is good is the central question of all ethics, the central question of all philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. So weapons, yeah, weapons is just another example, right? Of how do we do it, right? Right.
We have one question online and then. So the online question is, I have a question to Dr. Faheem Hussain. I am curious to know to what extent social media is used to spread propaganda against Rohingya in Myanmar and how Rohingya is portrayed or Rohingya as a term is used on social media in Bangladesh.
So as I mentioned before, Rohingyas, there are still, I think, 10 to 15% Rohingyas still living in the concentration camps in Myanmar, inside Myanmar. The rest is outside the country, majority in Bangladesh, in the refugee camps. So, and the genocide or the ethnic cleansing has been going on for many times, for many months, many years. So during that time, the social media uh, the hashtags that I mentioned, the Bengali and the word Rohingya is banned in Myanmar, by the way. You cannot use the word Rohingya because it's not existent. So they are not even recognized in the country. They are Bengali or their color. That's the whole idea of it. Now, crossing the border, they are now in a majority of now in Bangladesh, and as a person born in Bangladesh, it's I feel shame to admit that the word Rohingya is now the N word in Bangladesh, is the lowest of the low. So people are blaming each other, saying you are a bloody Rohingya, so get out of this thing. So that's how things are portrayed. And in the social media, especially, there's a huge conflict of access to resources. Again, there's no good or bad because that part of Bangladesh has been struggling with resources. Then the Rohingyas showed up. So there are huge issues, and that social media is full of all the fake news and the portals in that part of Bangladesh against Rohingya.
But the microphone is for the folks on Zoom so they can hear. In case you're wondering why.
Professor Hussain, the Wikipedia's article on the Rohingya genocide says that it started in 2016, and I was alive in 2016, but I didn't hear anything about this. It feels shocking that when you're describing it, it feels like something that feels more like placed in the 90s next to Bosnia or next to Rwanda, but just upon searching and seeing 2017, how did this? I mean, I don't want to go over where I was in 2017, but how did this miss everyone? What can you talk a little bit about that? It's shocking.
So the persecution of Rohingya, again, it's as our colleagues will say, it takes time. When you are othering people, it takes time. So in the early 80s, there was this constitution. They rewrote their constitution in Myanmar. That's when they had class-based citizenship, and the Rohingyas were not recognized as one of the ethnic groups in Burma or Myanmar during that time. That was the start of othering and dehumanizing the Rohingyas from the early 80s. And they have been crossing borders since to Bangladesh, since the 80s and the 90s. But then 2015, not just 2016, 2015, 16, there was a huge cyclone in 2015, as far as I remember, 15 or something. During that time also, there was a huge, there was at least some coverage of this boat full of Rohingya people getting stuck in the cyclone, and then they were gone. And so during that time as well. But it was in the peak during that time in 16 and 17, because it was during the time also in the constitution of Myanmar, or in the law they have, if something is burned through arson, that land, that property belongs to the government. And the army government really needed the lands during that time. So they orchestrated this plan. It was part of a bigger, older plan anyway, to expedite that. And there are many theories for that. There are theories that some certain neighboring country wanted to have access to the deep sea port. There are also issues with the drug war. There are issues between infighting and how you instigate that thing. But yeah, but they really needed to burn those villages and cities so that they can then claim that, hey, these are our things. Now, and Google Earth showed that once those were burned, there's no village whatsoever. They redefined it, realigned it, renamed those things. So, and why we didn't know about it? Because those were not attractive. Those were not clickable images. Those were not clickable news to begin with. So that's why we did not know about that. And a big part of Rohingya genocide was also to do with religious persecution. Now, the Western understanding of those persecution and who is the usual, offenders of religious persecution and who is on the victim side of it was also challenged in the Rohingya genocide. which was not, they were very confused. So I think that's why. Did I confuse you more? Maybe.
With rapid technology development and ready access to ever less expensive technology, what do you foresee as the greatest area of concern or risk to humanity going forward? And then the next one is, as media has become decentralized through the internet, everyone now can broadcast and amplify dangerous ideas widely. Do you know of any country/government that has a healthy, respectful, effective policy for monitoring and interestingly, I think that's for the panelists generally. So whoever wants to tackle that first, please feel free.
No, I don't think anybody has, from what I can tell. No. And I mean, I'm a historian, but I perhaps for one or two advisors wade a little bit too much in the current world, but because I think history is so applicable to explain what's happening in that world. But no, I mean, personally, I think what I find interesting about Rwanda is that it could really just happen anywhere. So it's just, to me, what's really interesting is you think it's just going to be not you, and then you would find yourselves like in this stew for so long of hearing, like we're in it right now. So need I say more?
Well, it may seem surprising as being somebody who studies the technology of the Holocaust, but I'm actually a technological optimist in general. And maybe it's because I spent 30 years at a technological university, but I mean, I feel that properly thinking engineers can really solve a lot of the problems that face us today. Right. I know the media all now is saying that, AI is the thing that's going to destroy us. I mean, I just shrug. I mean, let's see. There's been lots of claims that certain technologies are going to destroy us in my lifetime, and we're still here. I just think ultimately we manage technological solutions. Now, are all of them good from a moral point of view? No. Right, but they are solutions.
Can I quickly add something? So the thing is, AI is there to stay. There will be, it's the new buzzword. Next season, there will be something else. But the whole idea, I feel like, in addition to the big data, we also need to look into the small data. We need to make sure that more people have equitable access to the conversations. Now imagine, the AI, whatever they're generating is based on the data set they're having access to. Predominantly, it's Western specific, Northern specific. Hence, there's a huge bias. Internet was also like that, has been also like that. So that's not the fault of the internet. It's the fault of the system that the users and the providers that were doing it. So did the Rohingya stop? No, they came up with their own communication network that works for them, but may not be for a larger scale, but at least they're surviving. But we want to thrive. So what I would say is the more we invest on equitable, accessible technologies, then I can also become an optimist of technology. But until now, I'm definitely a tech pessimist. And I think for the future to be for everyone, which is our tagline for our school, we need to have more in-person conversation. Real people.
So, but you're not a technological pessimist. You're a pessimist about the political and cultural landscape of the technology, right? Sure. So, right. One last